Soup is one of the oldest things humans ever learned to cook. Archaeologists have found evidence of it stretching back roughly 20,000 years, long before agriculture, long before written language, long before anyone built a permanent home. The oldest known written recipe, from ancient Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago, reportedly called for hippopotamus meat, along with lentils, vegetables, and spices. Hippos were far more widespread back then, but catching one and turning it into dinner was no casual afternoon. Today, nearly every culture on Earth has its own version of soup, and almost all of them carry histories that have nothing to do with what you'd expect. Pho. Vietnam's national dish has a surprisingly recent and tangled origin. Food historians place its birth in northern Vietnam, around the city of Nam Dinh, in the late 1800s during French colonial rule. Around 1898, thousands of French laborers arrived to build what would become one of the largest textile plants in colonized Indochina, a factory in Nam Dinh province that employed over 18,000 workers. They brought with them an appetite for beef. Before the French arrived, Vietnamese rarely ate it. Cattle were draft animals, and the local diet revolved around pork, chicken, and water buffalo. Thrifty local cooks started collecting the bones and scraps the colonizers discarded and simmered them into a deep, fragrant broth, pairing it with flat rice noodles that Chinese traders had already brought to the region. The name itself is still debated. Some say it comes from the French fou, as in pot au feu, the classic French beef stew. Others trace it to the Cantonese phen, meaning flat rice noodle. Both influences were present, and neither camp has settled the question. Beef pho came first. Chicken pho only appeared in the 1930s after the colonial government restricted beef sales to preserve cattle, and cooks simply switched to whatever protein was available. When Vietnam was partitioned in 1954, roughly 1 million Northerners moved south, bringing pho with them and creating the more garnish-heavy Southern style, with bean sprouts, fresh herbs, hoisin, and chili. After the war, Vietnamese refugees carried it across the Pacific, and by the 1980s, pho restaurants were spreading through California, Australia, and eventually the rest of the world. Pho combined French bones with Chinese noodles in a Vietnamese kitchen. But across the East China Sea, another noodle soup was going through its own transformation, one that would end up changing the way the entire planet eats: ramen. What the world now thinks of as a Japanese creation actually started in China. Chinese immigrants brought wheat noodle soups to Japanese port cities like Yokohama in the late 1800s, and the dish evolved from there over decades. The springy yellow noodles get their distinctive bounce and color from kansui, an alkaline mineral water that transforms the texture of the dough. Japan didn't just borrow the concept, it regionalized it. Sapporo became known for rich miso ramen, often served with corn and butter. Hakata in Fukuoka became famous for milky white tonkatsu broth, made by boiling pork bones for hours until the collagen breaks down into a thick, creamy liquid. Kitakata developed a lighter, soy-based bowl. Each city treats its local ramen almost like a point of civic pride. But the moment that truly changed ramen's place in the world came in 1958. A Taiwanese-Japanese inventor named Momofuku Ando had spent a full year experimenting in a small wooden shed behind his house in Osaka, trying to figure out how to make noodles that could sit on a shelf indefinitely and cook in minutes. His breakthrough was deceptively simple. He found that flash-frying cooked noodles removed the moisture and preserved them almost without limit. Add hot water, and they came back to life. The result was chicken ramen, the world's first instant ramen, and it initially sold for 35 yen, roughly 6 times the price of fresh noodles. In 1971, Ando introduced cup noodles after watching American buyers eat his noodles from styrofoam cups instead of bowls. He promoted them at a tasting booth outside a Tokyo department store, where he sold over 20,000 cups in a single 4-hour session. By 2005, instant ramen had even gone to space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. Today, more than 120 billion servings of instant noodles are consumed worldwide every single year. Ramen conquered the world by making itself convenient. The next soup took the opposite approach, building its entire reputation on raw intensity. Tom Yum. The name breaks down simply in Thai. Tom means boiling, and yum refers to a style of mixing that balances sour, salty, sweet, and spicy in a single preparation. The soup traces back to central Thailand's Chao Phraya River basin, where riverside communities built meals around the freshwater shrimp and fish right outside their homes. The most popular version, Tom Yum Goong, uses whole shrimp, and many Thai cooks fry the shrimp heads separately to concentrate the flavor before folding them back into the broth. What gives Tom Yum its unmistakable character is a combination of three aromatics that rarely shows up together outside Thai cooking. Lemongrass, galangal, and makrut lime leaves form the backbone, and the soup gets its signature punch from fish sauce, fresh lime juice, and crushed chilies. There are two main styles. The original, Tom Yum Nam Sai, has a clear broth. The creamier version, Tom Yum Nam Kon, is more modern and uses evaporated milk to soften the heat. Adding coconut milk is a common misunderstanding outside Thailand. That belongs to a completely different soup, Tom Kha. In December 2024, UNESCO inscribed Tom Yum Goong on its representative list of intangible cultural heritage, making it Thailand's first food to receive the recognition. The inscription acknowledged not just the recipe itself, but the entire network around it, from the farming of lemongrass and galangal to the coastal fishing communities that supply the shrimp. Tom Yum earned its UNESCO status through decades of deep cultural significance. But another soup received the same recognition under far more urgent and far more political circumstances. Borscht. The deep red soup that people across the world associate with Eastern Europe hides a secret in its own name. Borscht doesn't come from beets. The word traces to a Proto-Slavic term for common hogweed, a wild plant whose fermented stems and leaves formed the base of the original sour soup, somewhere in what is now Ukraine, possibly as far back as the 5th century. Beets only replaced hogweed around the 16th century, and they're the reason the soup turned that iconic ruby color. Before that, borscht was an entirely different thing. It spread across Eastern Europe in dozens of regional variations. Some versions use sorrel instead of beets, creating a green borscht. Others use fermented rye for a white version. Some add mushrooms, fish, or sour plums depending on where you are. Nearly all of them are served with a spoonful of sour cream and a side of bread or garlic rolls called pampushki. In July 2022, UNESCO took the unusual step of fast-tracking Ukrainian borscht cooking onto its list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. It was the first time since the 2003 convention that an element had been added on an emergency basis. The reason was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which was displacing the communities, farmland, and family kitchens where the tradition lived. Russia has long claimed borscht as well, and the cultural tug-of-war over who owns the soup predates the current conflict by generations. UNESCO was careful to note that the inscription recognizes a living practice among Ukrainians, not exclusive ownership. Ukraine's culture minister was less diplomatic, posting that the victory in the war for borscht had been won. Borscht began as food for the poor and became a symbol of national identity. The next soup followed a strikingly similar arc, rising from the cheapest ingredients in the market to become one of the most celebrated dishes in all of French cooking: French onion soup. Onion-based soups have existed since Roman times because onions were cheap, grew nearly year-round, and made a natural base for anyone cooking on almost nothing. But the gratinade version that most people picture today, with a thick crust of melted cheese stretching from the rim of a heavy ceramic crock, came together in 19th century Paris around the Les Halles market. Les Halles was the enormous central food market that supplied the entire city of Paris. The laborers who hauled crates and butchered meat through the cold early morning hours needed something cheap, hot, and filling before dawn. Meanwhile, wealthy Parisians stumbling out of cabarets and nightclubs at 3 in the morning wanted something to settle their stomachs. French onion soup served both crowds from the same pot. The bowl that fueled a laborer's shift doubled as a fashionable hangover cure for the upper class, and the restaurants surrounding Les Halles became famous for it. The technique is what elevates it. Onions are caramelized slowly, sometimes for over an hour, until they turn deep, golden brown and intensely sweet. They go into a rich beef broth, get ladled into oven-safe bowls, topped with thick slices of toasted bread, buried under a layer of grated Gruyere or Comté, and broiled until the cheese bubbles and blisters into a golden crust. The romantic legend crediting King Louis XV with inventing it from onions, butter, and champagne in a hunting lodge is almost certainly fiction. The real story is simpler and better. It was food made by people who needed to eat well on very little. French onion soup is defined by heat, slow caramelization, a broiler's blast, steam curling off the crock. But in southern Spain, the most famous soup in the country is never heated at all: gazpacho. The cold, bright red tomato soup that people associate with summer in Andalusia has an origin that would surprise anyone who has only tasted the modern version. The original gazpacho contained no tomatoes whatsoever. It dates back to at least the 8th century in southern Spain, during the period of Moorish rule in what was then called Al-Andalus. Field laborers pounded stale bread, garlic, olive oil, vinegar, salt, and water together in a wooden bowl called a dornillo, creating a thick, pale paste they could eat while working under brutal midday heat. It was pure survival food, cheap, hydrating, and made entirely from ingredients that kept without refrigeration. Tomatoes only entered the picture after they arrived from the Americas, and even then it took centuries for them to become standard in the recipe. The blended red gazpacho that fills glasses at Spanish restaurants today is essentially a 19th century invention at the earliest. Spain has an entire family of cold soups that rarely make it onto menus outside the country. Salmorejo, from the city of Córdoba, is thicker and richer, often topped with diced jamón and hard-boiled egg. Ajo blanco is an older Moorish version made with almonds and garlic, completely white, sometimes served with fresh grapes. These are not variations of gazpacho. They are separate soups with their own long histories, and in some cases, they predate the tomato version by hundreds of years. Gazpacho sparked centuries of argument over what belongs in a cold soup. Across the Atlantic, another soup triggered a fight so intense that one politician tried to make the wrong answer a crime: clam chowder. The word chowder itself comes from the French chaudière, meaning cauldron, and the tradition likely arrived in North America with Breton fishermen who settled the coasts of Newfoundland and New England. The earliest printed chowder recipe appeared in the Boston Evening Post in 1751, but it was actually a fish chowder made with pork, biscuit, and claret wine. No clams, no milk, no potatoes. Clam-specific recipes didn't appear in American cookbooks until the 1830s. The argument everyone knows about is New England versus Manhattan. New England chowder uses cream or milk, producing the thick, white, velvety soup that Americans think of first. Manhattan chowder uses tomatoes, creating a thinner, lighter, reddish broth. A third version from Rhode Island skips both entirely and relies on a clear broth with nothing but clams, potatoes, and onion. The cream version, developed first in 18th century Massachusetts fishing towns where dairy was cheap and plentiful. The tomato version traces to Portuguese and Italian immigrant communities in Rhode Island and New York, who naturally cooked with tomatoes and brought that habit into the chowder pot. In 1939, a Maine state representative named Cleveland Sleeper drafted a bill proposing criminal penalties for anyone who added tomatoes to clam chowder. The suggested punishment, according to one contemporary account, involved the offender digging up a barrel of clams at high tide. Whether the bill was a genuine legislative filing or an annual publicity stunt depends on which historian you ask, but the spirit behind it was real enough. New Englanders took their chowder seriously enough to treat tomatoes as an act of betrayal. No such law was ever actually passed. Chowder divided one country over its ingredients. The next soup divided two entire nations over who gets to claim it. Laksa. This rich, spicy noodle soup emerged from one of the most fascinating cultural collisions in Southeast Asian history. When Chinese migrants settled along the Malay Peninsula centuries ago, they intermarried with local Malay communities and created a distinct culture known as Peranakan, or Straits Chinese. Laksa came out of that kitchen, fusing Chinese rice noodles with Malay spice paste called rempa and rich coconut milk. The name may come from a Hindi or Persian word for a type of vermicelli, or from Cantonese for spicy sand, a reference to the gritty texture of ground-dried shrimp in the broth. Nobody has settled it. Two major families of laksa exist. Curry laksa is the rich, coconut milk version that people outside Southeast Asia are most likely to encounter. Assam laksa is completely different. A sour, tamarind-based fish soup from Penang that uses torched ginger flour and contains no coconut at all. In Singapore, the Katong neighborhood became famous for a version where the noodles are cut short enough to eat with just a spoon. Both Malaysia and Singapore claim laksa as a national treasure, and the debate shows no sign of resolution. Hawker stalls in both countries guard their recipes closely, and asking whose version is more authentic can easily start a conversation that outlasts the meal itself. When pressed on the question, Malaysia's own Ministry of Tourism reportedly admitted it had never conducted a formal study on where laksa actually originated, which probably says everything that needs to be said. Laksa carries the identity of two nations in a single bowl. The last soup on this list carries something even deeper, bridging faiths in a country where food and devotion have always been inseparable. Harira. The name comes from the Arabic word harir, meaning silk, and it describes the texture of the finished soup perfectly. A smooth, velvety broth of tomatoes, lentils, chickpeas, and warm spices like ginger, turmeric, cinnamon, and black pepper, thickened at the very end with a flour and water slurry called teduira that gives it that distinctive silky body. Some Moroccan cooks let the teduira ferment for a day or two before stirring it in, which deepens the flavor in a way that fresh batter cannot replicate. The soup is finished with generous handfuls of chopped fresh cilantro and parsley and a squeeze of lemon just before it reaches the table. Harira is most closely tied to Ramadan in Morocco. When the Maghrib call to prayer sounds at sunset, marking the end of the daily fast, the tradition is to break the fast first with a date and a glass of water, followed immediately by a steaming bowl of harira alongside hard-boiled eggs and chabakia, a sesame and honey pastry. After roughly 15 hours without food or water, harira delivers exactly what the body needs: gentle rehydration, slow-burning energy from the lentils and chickpeas, protein from lamb or chicken, and deep warmth from the spices. But harira does not belong to one tradition alone in Morocco. Moroccan Jews have long eaten it to break the fast on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. In a country where food and faith run deeply together, harira sits in a rare and quietly remarkable place. It belongs to everyone at the table, regardless of which fast they happen to be ending.